afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Penalty Enhancements Demand Response Investigation and Tolling for this meeting. Today's stakeholder call will talk about the draft tariff language. As well, my name is Brenda Corona on behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs. We welcome you to this call. It's being recorded for information and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the IOS's permission. If you do experience any technical issues, you can reach out to Silas, our event producer, or myself, and we'll be able to assist you. Meanwhile, we'll go ahead and ask for those who want to ask a question during the call. Make sure you use the raise hand icon located on the bottom toolbar above the chat window. And if you're dialed in audio only, press *3. Remember to state your full name and affiliation before making a comment, and then also send them through the chat, and we'll be able to say those out loud during the call. For today's agenda, we'll just go ahead and do a quick overview on where we're at in terms of the stakeholder initiative timeline, and then I'll pass it to David Dutlow, who is our lead counsel for this tariff language. And we also have Dinesh, who's also our policy developer here for this initiative, who's here to assist us, and Angelica Stahl, who's also here with us as panelists. So currently we are moving towards the proposal development phase where we're posting the draft tariff language. We will be going over a little bit on the posting of it and also the comments that we'll be accepting for this tariff language changes. And then we'll move forward to the final proposal within the next few months, I think next month. So we'll make sure we address that when the time comes. And at this time, we can go ahead and give David Dutlow presentation, right? So he'll be sharing his screen for the tariff language. And then that's all. Thank you.
Excuse me. Okay, well, excuse me for that. Hi, good afternoon. So we have the draft tariff for the Patriot Initiative. What I'm sharing on my screen now is the, is the draft tariff. There are, a few incremental edits to what was posted, I guess, a week ago or so. So I'll be going off that. I don't think it should impact, comments that anyone was planning to make. Maybe it will, but we'll see. But I'll just sort of go from the top. Obviously, bulk of the changes are in Section 37 because it's rules of conduct. There are edits in other parts of the tariff as well, so we'll talk about those. Just to make this straightforward, I'll just start at the top and not try to jump around by topic, but just go by section number. I think it'd be too much jumping around if I did it by topic. But anyway, so in Section 10.3, it's talking about meter data submission. And just a few kind of cleanup edits here. This is really probably clarifications, cleanup edits we could have made in the rules of conduct enhancements filing, which we made in January. But this is just a reference to when we're talking about settlement quality meter data submission. There's a reference to submitting by T52. There's a reference if you don't, then you're subject to sanction. That concept is there. I'm just updating the tariff section to be more general, 37.5.2 instead of going down to 37.5.2.2. The numbering moved around with the rules of conduct enhancements filing. So nothing substantive here, just kind of making a more general cross-reference rather than trying to get all the way down into the exact sub-level of tariff. But nothing substantive. That's just really cleanup. Okay, moving into Section 11, types of settlements and billing. So 11.6 is a general section that covers PDRs, RDRRs, distributed energy resource aggregations, and non-generator resources for storage. So this is the section in both Section 11.6.1 and 11.6.7 that has that phrase that you see struck out here, and I'll explain why it's struck out in a moment. That thing, for monitoring, compliance, and audit purposes, scheduling coordinators must submit base load data and underlying consumption. That was really the monitoring data that we were talking about all along in terms of having a penalty for failure to submit that data And so that was that really major element of the PEDR initiative overall. So section 11.6.1 has that current statement for monitoring compliance audit purposes that shows is struck out, and then section 11.6.7 has that same language, it's struck out. And then what we did here, and this is I think a difference from what was posted, is rather than have that embedded in the section there, we just created a new subpart of 11.6, which would show up as 11.6.8, creating just a global obligation for all proxy demand resources or reliability demand response resources to submit the complete set of demand response monitoring data, by the SQMD submission deadline, which is T2B, and then saying, clarifying existing language, saying only demand response energy measurements will be considered sediment quality meter data. That sentence is existing language. And then something we added here, which was something that was touched on in the policy process a little bit, is, we're talking about 45 days of data. And some of the methodologies, performance evaluation methodologies, have a look-back window that can exceed 45 days. And so what this means, if we're only obligating submission of the 45 days of data, it's possible that the baseline for those other resource types was calculated with data that wasn't fully included in this monitoring data submission, the package of data that would be obligated to be submitted under this. So what we're saying is here that if you have a longer look-back period, then the ISO can request it and you must submit it upon request. But we're not going to cover that in what's called the quote demand response monitoring data. And then we'll get into section 37. You'll see that, failure to submit timely demand response monitoring data will have the penalties that was discussed in the policy paper. But so that we would have the right to ask for data exceeding the 45 days for those methodologies that have a look-back window that can go past 45 days, but that would not be covered by the new demand response penalties. That would just be a general obligation to provide the data upon request. And so I said I wouldn't jump around, and now I'm already going. I will jump down to Appendix A. This term demand response monitoring data, excuse me, I had initially hoped we would not be creating a new defined term in Appendix A. However, it didn't really kind of come together. I kind of had to. So let me just jump down there right away to Appendix A, demand response monitoring data. So that would be the proposed definition of the term. It's the actual underlying consumption of energy relevant to PDR, RDRR during all hourly intervals for 45 days prior to the day on which a demand response event occurs. So I think that verbiage mostly matches what was in the existing tariff, and then we're adding it as a 45 days, all hourly intervals in those 45 days, and then it's for all PDRs or RDRRs. And then, there was that phrase in the current tariff for monitoring, auditing, and compliance purposes. I didn't think that specific preface needed to stay in the tariff. I think it's data to provide, and sort of why it's being provided is sort of not really, doesn't need to be called out in the tariff. It's just a data submission obligation, and then we will use it. And then, as defined, it's not settlement quality data. So it's just whatever analytic purposes we're going to use it for. So I will pause there if there are any questions on sort of, and this here is really the preface to the penalties. The penalty is for not saying the monitoring data, but what I've talked about so far is nailing down what it is that the substantive obligation is in the first place. And then we can jump into section 37 in a moment, but I'll stop there if there's questions about the sort of language on defining what the obligation is. And if there's no questions, that's fine. We'll come back if something pops into your head. But with that, I'll move on to then section 22. This was a change that was added somewhat late in the policy process, but this is nothing to do with demand response monitoring. This is the removal of the report to the Secretary of Energy when a entity that is immune under federal law from paying rules of conduct sanctions, which is, our federal power marketing administrations that participate in the ISO, which is WAPA and BPA. So they are exempt from paying rules penalties under Section 22.9A. Section 22.9 is the number again. Section 22.9B says when that immunity is invoked, the ISO is supposed to send a report to the U.S. Department of Energy Secretary advising of that. And what we propose to do here is delete that requirement. We thought that it's kind of not necessary that, BPA and WAPA are part of the Department of Energy, and if the Secretary of Energy or some other appropriate departmental official wants to have insight into what's happening on rules of conduct with those entities in the CAISO market, that can all be handled internally. There's no real need for the ISO to kind of get in the middle of how the U.S. Department of Energy organizes itself or whatnot. So, that's information that can be sort of shared internally within the Department of Energy. There's no, I think, real compelling need for the ISO to send this report, writing it up, all that. It's an administrative burden. We just didn't see how it really served a useful purpose, and it just kind of becomes a pain in the neck for us. So that was what you see in 22.9B being deleted. Okay, if there's no questions, I will move on to the heart of Section 37. Do we see any hands up or callers queued or anything like that?
I don't see any hands up at this time, David.
Okay. Very good. So here we are now in Section 37, the rules of conduct. This is, core of what we're here to talk about. So I have the full Section 37 here, but obviously there's targeted edits. So right here is the prefatory section, 37.1.5, distinguishing the parts of the rules of conduct that the ISO administers versus what FERC administers, adding a reference to Section 37.7, because that is where we place the the demand response monitoring data rules. So it was an unused section, 37.7, that was empty, repurposing it now to write out the monitoring data penalty. So that's the reference there, just to be thorough that list covers all of the things the ISO is administering penalties. Okay, scrolling down, keep going, and we'll stop when I get to this. Okay, so here we go. This is the language that, with the rules of conduct enhancements, we pretty significantly rewrote meter data penalties to kind of organize it better, in addition to implement the new penalty structure of the lower of 30% or $1,000, which is, y'all remember from the last initiative. So this is Section 37.5.2, accurate timely SQMD. What we added here for inaccurate meter data, Section 37.5.2.1.1, policy process talks about a materiality threshold for meter data submissions, saying that if the inaccuracy is within a certain tolerance band, it will no longer be deemed a violation of the rules of conduct. It'll just be, an incorrect state of meter data, but it's not a rules of conduct violation. So that's what you see on the screen here. That's the basically the carve out or the exception written in this section, saying that we apply a materiality threshold such that scheduling coordinator has not violated this section if the net error across the trading day is less than the larger of 3% of the correct values or 3 megawatts. So that was the rule, 3% or 3 megawatts. If your error is less than that, then congratulations, no penalty. And with the new penalty scheme, I mean, I think those small errors, 30% of that error would have been probably a very small penalty anyway, but it would make parties ineligible for the rules of conduct penalty distribution, and so that was sort of the logic there. It's not actually a huge reduction in penalty exposure, but it does reduce it somewhat, and we were comfortable that having this, this materiality threshold was okay. It wouldn't mute the incentives for timely accurate meter data to the extent that it would be a problem. So that's what you see there. But importantly, you scroll down a little bit, the market adjustment, we are saying that when you are not deemed to be in violation because of that materiality threshold, you are still in line for a market adjustment charge if it would have applied otherwise. So if you correct the inaccuracy at, I don't know, T plus 100, so then when we run the T plus what? The T plus, was it 10 months? T plus 11 months? Whatever data we close out at T plus 214B. Okay, yeah. T plus 11 months, sorry. Got my numbers mixed up. So let me start that example over. If you submit corrected data at, say, 100 business days after the trading date, that's inaccurate. But if it's within the materiality threshold, then we say no rules of conduct violation. But we still need to process the correct data. And because that was submitted before 214B, which means that correct data will pass on the T plus 11M, no market adjustment, no penalty. But if for some reason we don't run a T11M statement, or the correct data is submitted after T plus 214B, then a market adjustment would apply. If the initial error was in your benefit, then you would have, have been advantaged to some degree by the error to the market adjustment. So that was, hopefully that explanation made sense. But in any case, if you benefit from this new materiality threshold, you will still be charged a market adjustment if one would otherwise apply. Okay, well, I'll keep going, and someone stop me if there's questions, Cuda. Okay, here we have in section 37.6.1.1, this is what I call just a clarification that it's stating something that is kind of obvious, but it was never stated explicitly. So while we're in here opening up the hood, we'll tinker a little bit. The required information generally statement in section 37.6.1.1, all information that's required to be submitted by the tariff must be submitted. Okay, fine. What we never stated explicitly before was there are other specific rules of conduct that deal with information submission. And so, you could look at that and say, if you fail to submit meter data on time, you have a meter data violation, but then separately you failed to submit information that's required under the tariff and you didn't do it by the specified deadline. So not only do you get the meter data penalties, but you also get a $500 a day penalty on top of that. We would never implement it that way. I think it's sort of implicit that if you have a specific penalty, charge a specific penalty, and then if it falls into this sort of catch-all, goes there, but we never said it explicitly. So here it's just so there's no confusion. If you have like the meter data violation or section 37.7, which is the new demand response monitoring data, you get that penalty. We're not going to double penalize you, which again, never done that. That would be a very, that would be, probably not a reasonable thing to do, but just making it explicit there. Okay, we'll keep going. All right, so here we have section 37.7, provide demand response monitoring data. So this is the heart of the new demand response monitoring data penalty. So what you see here is it's sort of organized, modeled somewhat on the meter data penalties that were as they were redrafted for the Rules of Conduct Enhancements Initiative. So 37.7.1 talks about the expected conduct. 37.7.2 then says what sanctions are for failure to do the required conduct. And then like with meter data, kind of define a late demand response monitoring data violation and then separately define a missing demand response monitoring data. So if you remember, for meter data, we have now a late meter data, missing meter data, and inaccurate meter data. And so here, for the demand response monitoring data, we do not have an inaccurate demand response monitoring data violation. You know, if the monitoring data is submitted and it's incorrect, well, that's not good. Data should be correct, but we're not calling that out as a specific rules of conduct violation. Difference being meter data is the basis of a market settlement. So the inaccuracy matters to the market settlement process, and we need to have, you know, some penalties incentivize accuracy. Here, the monitoring data is for monitoring, it's not for market settlement. So, you know, the inaccuracy of that was not viewed as being, you know, rising to the level of having the need for the penalty, and that's the policy I'm describing. But then for late submission or missing, that is part of the policy. Late being if you fail to submit it by the SQMD submission deadline at T+52B, but you submit it by the 214B deadline, that is late. And then if you never submit it or fail to submit it by 214B, that's considered missing. And so it's, again, the monitoring data is not meter data, but we're sort of treating it on a parallel track and kind of treating it in a similar function. So that's the expected conduct. And then the sanctions say late is $1,000, and then the sanction applies per trading day per SCID. And I know that was, you know, an important point that it would be overly punitive for the penalty to have applied per resource. And what you see here is that reflected. The sanction applies per trading day per SCID. Same with missing demand response monitoring data, $4,000, and then it applies per trading day per SCID. So if a single SCID has 10 demand response resources, all of which have late DR data, that's not multiple penalties, it's a single penalty of $1,000. Same for missing. And then this next sentence here, what it says, I'm highlighting, it says if one SC has both late and missing, so one resource it reports as late, one as missing, okay, that's not going to be a $5,000 penalty. We'll just go to the higher penalty. So it'll be treated as a missing DR penalty. So you would be penalized once for the higher threshold penalty of $4,000, and that's just sort of to sort of make explicit. I think it's sort of implicit in the way it's written, but again, if we can be clear and explicit on some of these things, that's better. So that's just saying that if one SC has both late and missing for the same trading day, we would just apply the one missing penalty at $4,000. Okay, well, I will keep going into the process amendments. And again, here, this is just updating to refer to section 37.7 to note that now it has content in it, whereas it didn't before. So that's just a cross-reference. Okay, so just generally section 37.8, the process for investigation enforcement. Here's where we see us kind of shuffling the investigative process a little bit. You know, I think it, you know, in the policy we talked about this. So here's where the policy of really going down to 2 letters instead of 3 letters, you know, sort of explicit 3 letters was never exactly called out in the tariff, but it was sort of the consequence of the way it was written really meant we had a 3-letter process. Now the way this is written is kind of more explicitly about what the notices are, and then more explicit that it's 2 notices, not 3. So what we've written here in section 37.8.3 is kind of setting out the first step is a preliminary investigation. So this is not spelled out, say, in the tariff. It's just sort of to create kind of a complete conceptual framework of what the investigation is. So the first step, sort of step 0 really is we acknowledge there's some issue of a rules of conduct nature. And then, so that's kind of step 0. So step 1 is then the preliminary investigation. Okay, we have facts suggesting maybe there's an issue. Step 1, preliminary investigation. We need to sort of figure out what's going on. and this is a preliminary investigation based just on whatever the ISO has available to it within its possession. So it says here, facts, data, other information within its possession. So, you can imagine what that means. We're just kind of doing internally, asking around, internally, trying to see, what do we know? Is this a problem? Is it a potential problem? Actually, false alarm is no problem at all. So that happens. Then section 37.8.4 talks about the notice of review. That is the first notice to the scheduling coordinator. If the preliminary investigation is done and we still believe there might have been a violation, then we reach out with the notice of review to the scheduling coordinator. This existing language is sort of showing up as, well, it shows up as green here, which is moved, but in case that gets lost along the way, we're maintaining the existing, language about how we also notify the market participant if, we have objective reason to know who the underlying market participant is. And if we don't, then we'll just purely be in touch with the scheduling coordinator. So we provide the notice of review. The notice of review, as it says here, provides the parties description of the violation and opportunity to respond with ISO with any issues or facts relevant to the violation being investigated. And then so that description, the next sentence says, it must be provided at a sufficient level of detail to allow for a meaningful response. So I think that is also existing language in some form that's just been moved. But yeah, the idea is you get a notice of review, provides enough information for the scheduling coordinator market participant to understand what is the possible violation, what is the basis of us thinking there's a possible problem, and then it's your chance as a scheduling coordinator to say, here's my response, here's the facts I have to support, the idea that there was no violation, which is, kind of the point of the response. And then you see the next sentence, next sentence, I'll highlight it here. So I think the point of streamlining it was, the scope of CAISO review on these is generally pretty limited. These are meant to be objectively defined issues. Usually there's not a need for an extended back and forth, and that was the kind of the logic of going from a 3-letter process to a 2-letter process. However, there might be some reason for more extended back and forth. There's always kind of the potential for odd factual circumstances, that justify a more extended back and forth between the ISO and the market participant. So what the sentence here says is basically to give comfort for those who are worried that this new 2-letter process is going to be too truncated. It's not going to give me a chance to really kind of have dialogue back and forth. So this sentence here is saying, if there's a need for more information or we have clarifying questions, that can still happen. And the idea would be that, if you have, as a scheduling coordinator, you have more information you think would suggest the violation didn't happen, if we ignored it, then you can still appeal to FERC, and that's sort of, honestly, I think the ISO would absolutely want to avoid cases where a market participant goes and appeals to FERC, and there's just like obvious facts that we missed that make it clear like there was no violation. I mean, we want to avoid that. That's kind of a waste of people's time, and that's just not, that's not administering the process well. So we would want to avoid that. So I think, we would exercise this sentence you see highlighted with that in mind. That if you say, wait, no, I have more facts to show you, I didn't, the violation didn't happen, whatever the violation is, we'll see what you have to say, because it's, we want to handle that before it goes to FERC if there's something there. Okay, so that's the notice of review. And finally, this is, again, something that wasn't 100% nailed down in the current tariff, so it's being explicit. A response to the notice of review is optional, which, to this point, there are times when the sort of rules of conduct process kicks off and there's no response to the notices, and that's fine. But, I think there's one question was raised is, well, does that mean my failure to respond is then a separate violation of the failure to provide investigative information, which is $1,000 a day, no, we wouldn't look at it that way. The opportunity to respond is for the benefit of the scheduling coordinator. If you have nothing to say, then you have nothing to say. So we wouldn't treat it as the failure to provide investigative information, but that wasn't explicit, so I'm just adding that sentence here to say the response is optional, so that question wouldn't arise in the future. Okay. Then we send the notice of review, the scheduling coordinator provides a response, then results of review, section 37.8.5 says, we'll review the information provided, all other information. We conclude the investigation, provide the results of review notice that says, whether we believe a violation occurred, and if so, what are the applicable sanctions for that violation. So that's sort of the end of the investigative process. And then I'll stop there. The next set of amendments is really more about the penalty assessment or penalty tolling provision. So I'll stop there if there's any questions, and I'll have a drink of water and see if anyone has questions. Okay, well, hearing nothing, I'll keep going. So section 37.8.6 then is saying we will assess the sanctions no sooner than 30 days after providing the results of review notice. So that ties into the penalty tolling, which I'll go down to in a minute. But basically, the big change we had for the penalty tolling was current tariff says if you want to appeal to FERC, you can do that if you file your appeal to FERC within the dispute deadline and you dispute your settlement statement within the dispute deadline, then the penalty is tolled pending FERC review. And then if FERC grants your appeal, then, nothing happens because you never paid. And then if FERC rejects the appeal, then we would put the penalty on a settlement statement again, and then, it would be invoiced. The change we did was to say, and the reason why we made a change was because the mechanics of the invoicing process kind of make that tricky. What would happen is almost all cases, once the sanction goes on a settlement statement to be disputed, it's kind of too late to stop it from moving to an invoice. There's another tariff section that talks about how all invoices have to be paid, even if there's a pending settlement dispute. And then so what would happen, just the mechanics would be, most cases, scheduling coordinator pays the sanction, and then it would get basically refunded, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks later, and then it would be even until FERC comes back with a decision on the appeal. And then, like I said, we'd either re-invoice it or leave it alone if FERC grants the appeal. So that process was a little funky, kind of tying it to the settlement statement. So we said, how about we just give you 30 days to file an appeal at FERC? And if you don't file the appeal at FERC after 30 days, then we just go ahead and invoice it then. So that's why you see it here. We do it no sooner than 30 days to provide an opportunity to get to FERC and file the appeal. So then, even though that's not specifically in the appeal section, it kind of ties. So now, review of determination, this is really the appeal section, section 37.8.10. So you can appeal to FERC by submitting a waiver request. I'll highlight this, that first sentence. I think the current language talks about submitting an appeal in accordance with FERC's rules and procedures. There's been some orders where FERC had interpreted that tariff section as obligating market participants to submit the appeal in the form of a Section 206 complaint, which, I don't think that was our intent to obligate participants to kind of go to that level of filing a 206 complaint. And, it wasn't kind of a big enough deal to kind of raise before, but, since, again, we're making a change here, I think it's justified. We could say it's a waiver request. There's some issues at FERC about when is a waiver request allowed or not allowed. I think it's justified, and it would provide an easier path to make the appeal just procedurally, maybe if there's no attorneys on the call for our market participants, but I think your attorneys would appreciate that. I think it wasn't meant to be such a high bar that you'd have to show the 206 standard to get the sanction appeal granted. I don't think it was meant to be that high of a standard. So what we're saying here is it's a waiver request, and it seems more appropriate way of handling it. So that's that first sentence I highlighted. Then you see the core thing about penalty tolling. Now we're saying the obligation to pay sanctions is tolled until FERC renders its decision if you do two things. Within 30 days of receiving the results of review notice, you have to file your appeal with FERC. That's A. And then B, you have to let us know you filed the appeal following the procedures established in the BPM. So the current tariff talks about disputing the settlement statement. That I think has been in the tariff for a very long time. I assume the logic there is, a settlement dispute is a tangible thing. So that's how you notify the ISO that you are appealing, which makes sense, because we weren't always necessarily served with the appeal filing at FERC. I think that's probably going overboard. We don't need to formally require a settlement dispute. I think we'll defer to the BPM. Most likely what the BPM would say is just submit it in a city ticket. That's good enough. But we need to know you filed within 30 days is the point, because like I said, we need to know if we're moving forward with passing the sanction to settlement statement or not. So if you do that, both of those things within the 30 days, the penalty will never show up until FERC renders its decision. If it rejects the appeal. If it grants the appeal, then we've never collected money in the first place, and you go on with things. And then another sentence here I added that if you want to appeal after the 30 days, that is allowed. That would not, it would not get penalty tolling, but if for some reason you file the appeal after the 30 days, that's not forbidden. Granted, if it's a waiver request, part of the waiver standard is a show of good faith, and there'd be a question if you waited, years and years, is that reflective of good faith waiver request? So there would be challenges, but I don't think we wanted it to be a hard deadline that if you don't do it within that 30 days, you're forever barred from appealing at FERC. FERC may have its own views, and like I said, they might see it as showing a lack of good faith in submitting waiver requests or whatever other reason they have. But the tariff itself, we don't think it was necessary to impose that timing obligation. Again, separating the tolling from the appeal. The tolling, absolutely 30 days. If you want to appeal after 30 days, okay, go ahead, but there's not going to be penalty tolling, and it's probably going to make it harder for the appeal to be upheld. But that's up to the scheduling coordinators and market participants. Okay, and then here you see it's a few edits just to clarify some of the timing about when we deem the sanctions, the different time limits. I'll get to in a second on section 37.10.1 that we have, 1 year from the discovery of events to impose the sanctions, 3 years overall. There's certain timing issues there, and I'm just sort of specifying more concretely, what kicks off, what starts the clocks. Okay, keep scrolling. So here, I'll stop here, section 37.9.4. This is the section that talks about who's eligible to get a allocation of the annual penalty proceeds. Because of the new penalty tolling rules, kind of had to break this up and kind of redefine it a little bit. So for the purposes of distributing penalty funds, you are ineligible if. So had to kind of break it into two parts, whereas before it was one part. So if you were assessed a sanction and you didn't toll it, then in that year that it was assessed, you are an ineligible market participant. You don't get an allocation of the proceeds. And then that's if you never requested tolling. If you did request tolling, then, okay, if you requested tolling in a calendar year, and FERC's decision later upheld the ISO's determination that a rules of conduct violation happened, then you are also ineligible for the year in which the appeal was filed. So that's to cover the idea that sometimes FERC takes a while to rule on the appeals. It can cross years, and then we have a question of which year are you ineligible for. So it's the year when you filed the appeal, regardless of when the decision may have been granted. So that means that in some cases we might be holding off on the allocation for a given calendar year if there's open appeals. And that was a topic we hit at in the rules of conduct enhancements filings in January. But so that just felt need to break up the two things in parts 1 and 2. Then you see part 3, that was something we added in rules of conduct enhancements. If you're exempt from penalty under section 22.9, that's fine, but you shouldn't be eligible for an allocation because you're never at risk of paying into the penalty pool. And again, that's to cover the federal power marketing agencies. So that's item 2. Just renumbered, but no change there, as you see. Okay, well, I'll keep scrolling. Time limitations. Here, this is really just a clarification, again, to existing language. The 90-day discovery. So here it says we have to issue a notice of review within 90 days of discovery of events that are potentially subject to sanction. That's an existing concept. It's just spelling it out a little bit better. We're not allowed to sit on an issue forever. If we find out about it, we have 90 days to begin the formal investigative process. Here, it would be defined as issuing the notice of review, which is that first external communication on the rules of conduct issue. So spelling that out a little more clearly, that it's 90 days to issue a notice of review once we discover events that are potentially problematic. And then here you see the next sentence. Our methodology for assessing the discovery date is established in the BPM. What that means is, sometimes sort of what is the discovery date is a little fuzzy to talk about. An example, I don't know, meter data. If you submit the data late after T plus 52B, there's that whole intermediate period between then and 214B. So when did we discover the data was submitted late, or that revision was made late? It's those sort of issues we need to kind of spell out in the BPM, and that gets sometimes into, kind of into the details of what specific type of rules of conduct issue we're even talking about. So that's just there to kind of address that issue. Okay, and then existing language, 1 year after discovery of the events, and then no later than 3 years after the day of violation. Existing language, we're not changing, but I mentioned that before, so that's where that is. Okay, well, that's the changes to section 37. I talked about the demand response monitoring data definition, so that is there again. Rules of conduct, it's a defined term, just adding reference to section 37.7, minor technical update. And then additionally, Appendix P of the tariff, which covers what our Department of Market Monitoring does, just updating some of the cross-references to the rules of conduct. Here saying, for example, a tariff violation that involves the tariff section that the ISO enforces through the rules of conduct, those are not something that DMM refers unless it's a part of some broader, manipulative scheme or whatever, but on its own, those aren't for referrals. So just updating some of the numbering, and then obviously adding in 37.7, which is the monitoring data. Okay, well, that is a run through all the amendments. Brenda, do we have any questions lined up yet, or at all?
Let me see. Let's give folks a few seconds to see if they have any questions. I don't see any. Silas, do you see any questions from your end?
No, I'm not seeing any questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, well, so we have the posted tariff, and I, I'll guess I'll hand it over to Brenda. She can remind you of the comment dates and such. Yeah, unless final call for questions. Otherwise, I will stop sharing and pass the mic over to Brenda.
Thank you, David. Appreciate the overview. Now we'll just go over the quick reminder on the next steps for this. The only step we have for this initiative for the penalty on demand response for Curter, it will be just the draft tariff language. Comments are due by the end of day September 5th. And then those are going to be located on the ISO, that webpage for the PERDER. And so you'll see the commenting template open just to submit your comments on that. And then also we will be monitoring any questions, but now since we are kind of wrapping up our call, we do have some announcements for the upcoming months, which include the Energy Blog Matters, which has posted a few blogs in regards to one being the transmission outlook, the other for the grid enhancement technologies from transmission network, and a WEIM energy market governance enhancements approved. We also have the policy initiative timeline that offers stakeholders a high-level overview of the ongoing policy initiatives. For this one, we also have included showing the next steps as well how it's going to the board in September. And then also it's just it helps everyone be informed about the weekly timeline that we have for this policy initiative. Next, we have the Stakeholder Symposium happening on October 29th and 30th. We do have a lot of attendees that have registered. If you haven't registered, please do as soon as you can. We will be hosting it at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento. But with that, I don't see any questions, and also we'll kind of just keep folks reminded, and I'm going to see if I could just send out that link for the penalty enhancements in my response investigation and tolling. So this one will help guide you to that where this draft tariff language is posted, and then the commenting to submit comments. And then if some questions do raise up, if you're not able to submit comments, feel free to send them over to isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And then I'll just give a few seconds before we wrap up the call, and I'll be handing it over to Silas to end our call. But I do see Dinesh, if you have any last comments, I do want to rephrase that I said earlier, no final proposal, just going straight to the board, I believe, in September. So there's many initiatives happening right now, so thanks so much for your patience, and thanks, David, for your overview today for the draft tariff language. Okay. I'll hand it to Silas to end our call.
Okay, thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. With that, our call is concluded, and you may now disconnect.